Somewhere in the Arizona desert, in the summer of 1899, a naked man is galloping bareback through the middle of town on a stolen pony, and he's laughing. Minutes earlier, he was standing in front of a horse trough, stripped down for a bath by two deputies who figured their newest prisoner could use a scrub. But this prisoner wasn't thinking about getting clean. He was staring past the trough, past the deputies, at a pony tied to a hitching post just a few feet away. And before either lawman could blink, he was on that horse's back, bare as the day he was born, thundering through one town, then straight through the next, disappearing into the mountains wearing nothing but a grin. If you think that sounds like the wildest thing this man ever did, you have no idea what's coming, because that jailbreak isn't even in his top 5. This is the true story of a cowboy turned cattle thief who escaped custody so many times using so many bizarre methods that lawmen across 2 entire counties eventually just gave up trying to hold him. They called him Climax Jim. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why no jail cell in Arizona could ever keep him. Welcome back to the channel. If this is your first time here, this is where we track down the strangest, most overlooked stories the Old West left behind. The ones that never made it into the big Hollywood westerns, but honestly probably should have. Here's the thing about Climax Jim. He wasn't a gunslinger, he wasn't a killer. As far as anyone can tell, he never even fired his pistol during a single one of his crimes. What he was a mediocre cattle rustler with an absolutely world-class talent for one very specific skill: getting out of jail. Over the course of his criminal career, this man broke out of custody so many times, using so many different methods: pocket knives, spoons, forged confessions, a literal wad of chewing tobacco, that lawmen practically threw up their hands every time they heard his name. So today, we're asking the questions that make this story worth telling. Who is the real man behind the name Climax Jim? How did a kid born in the nation's capital end up working cattle in the Arizona Territory? How exactly does someone escape from jail that many times and somehow still die of natural causes? And yes, we are going to get to the bottom of exactly where that name came from, because it's not what you think, and it's a lot more entertaining than you'd expect. Before we get into it, if you enjoy stories like this, the forgotten characters of the frontier who never make it into the textbooks, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like on this video, and let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from today. It genuinely helps this channel keep tracking down stories like this one. All right, let's rewind all the way back to 1876 and meet the boy who would eventually become the slipperiest outlaw in Arizona history. Our story begins far from the Arizona desert, in Washington, D.C., on November 17, 1876. That's where a baby boy was born to a pair of Canadian immigrant parents. Family legend has it that his mother and father wanted to name him after the sitting president at the time, Rutherford B. Hayes. But somewhere between the delivery room and the paperwork, something got fumbled, and the name that ended up on the birth certificate was Rufus. Rufus' nephew. As you might expect for a working-class kid born in 1876, there isn't much of a paper trail documenting his childhood. What we do know is that by 1894, at just 17 years old, Rufus' nephew had somehow made his way nearly 2,000 miles west and landed himself a job as a cowboy for one of the most notorious cattle outfits in the entire Arizona Territory, the Hash Knife Cattle Company. If you've never heard of the Hash Knife, understand that this wasn't some small family ranch. This was an operation on an almost unbelievable scale. We're talking about 60,000 head of cattle, roughly 2,000 horses spread across 2 million acres of range in northern Arizona. It's all bankrolled by wealthy investors sitting comfortably back east while their cowboys did the dangerous work. And those cowboys had a reputation that preceded them wherever they went. The historian Fraser Hunt once described the men who rode for the Hash Knife outfit as, without question, the most thieving, fighting bunch of cowboys the United States had ever produced. That wasn't an exaggeration for effect either. In the single year of 1886 alone, the town of Holbrook, the closest place for Hash Knife hands to blow off steam after weeks on the range, recorded 26 shooting deaths. 26. In one small frontier town in one single year. This was the world a teenage Rufus nephew walked into, armed with nothing but a head full of dreams and, according to his own later account, a 12-pound sack of chewing tobacco. And it's that sack of tobacco, more than anything else, that would end up defining the rest of his life, because it's exactly how he earned the nickname that would follow him into the history books. In his own words, given years later, Rufus described riding into a hash knife roundup camp as a young man, ready for a month out on the range. Knowing he'd be gone that long, he loaded up on supplies before he left. 12 pounds of a particular chewing tobacco brand called Climax, all stuffed into a gunny sack tied to his saddle. By his own account, over the course of 25 days out on that roundup, he chewed through every single leaf of that tobacco. By the time he rode back into camp, there wasn't a single cowhand in the entire outfit who wasn't calling him Climax Jim. Now, let's clear something up right away because the name does raise an eyebrow. Climax was simply the actual brand name of the chewing tobacco, a real product that, at the time, was genuinely one of the most popular chews in the country, favored by everyone from baseball players to working cowboys. The word climax itself just means the peak or the culmination of something. It traces back to an old Greek word for a ladder, essentially describing the top rung. It's entirely possible the tobacco company chose the name specifically because of its other, more suggestive connotation, hoping to get a knowing smirk out of customers in the store. But as far as young Rufus' nephew was concerned, the name had nothing to do with anything scandalous. He simply loved the tobacco enough to earn a nickname from it, and the name stuck with him for the rest of his life. From Cowboy, Rufus, now permanently known as Climax Jim, made the jump to cattle rustler. There was just one small problem. He wasn't especially good at it. Or, to be more precise, he wasn't especially good at not getting caught. What he did turn out to be exceptionally good at, almost supernaturally good at, was escaping from wherever the law happened to lock him up afterward. The very first arrest we have on record came in 1894, when the 17-year-old was caught stealing about a dozen steers from a slaughterhouse near Winslow, Arizona. The jail they threw him into was little more than an old adobe building, hardly built to hold a determined young man with a pocketknife. Jim simply waited until nightfall, dug his way straight through the wall, and walked out a free man. He didn't stay free long. Just a few months later, on the 4th of July, Jim decided to celebrate independence in his own personal way by stealing a horse over in Gila County. This time, the man who tracked him down was Sheriff John Thompson, a lawman who went by the fantastically fitting nickname Rimrock. Thompson caught up with Jim over in Pleasant Valley and started hauling him back toward the town of Globe. Taking no chances, Thompson chained Jim to a post when they made camp for the night. It didn't matter. Jim slipped free of those chains anyway, at least for a little while before Thompson managed to run him down and recapture him. And once Jim was locked up again, he pulled off the exact same trick he'd used back in Winslow, digging his way straight through the jailhouse wall. Only this time he didn't even have a pocket knife. He did it with a spoon. By this point, the authorities in the region had officially had enough. Rather than trust another local jail to hold him, they shipped Jim off to the Arizona Territorial Prison in Yuma, a place so notorious for its brutal conditions that people at the time simply called it the Hellhole of the West. And wouldn't you know it, this was the one place Jim actually couldn't find his way out of. He served a full 12 months behind those walls. But the moment he was released, he went right back to stealing cattle as if the previous year had simply been an inconvenient pause. By June of 1898, Jim was back in custody, this time arrested by a man who knew him personally, his former boss at the hash knife outfit, foreman Bert Mossman. That arrest apparently didn't stick for long because by New Year's Day of 1899, Jim found himself under a fresh indictment in Graham County for altering cattle brands. He was arrested yet again, and by late February, in what was becoming a running theme of his life, Jim and 3 fellow inmates had already broken out of that jail as well. When he was recaptured just days later, the sheriff decided enough was enough and had a blacksmith fit Jim with a special set of shackles, riveted shut so there'd be no picking his way free this time. Jim wriggled out of them anyway and climbed straight over the jail's outer wall. His freedom lasted, by most accounts, somewhere in the neighborhood of a few minutes before he was spotted, chased down and shackled right back up. It wasn't law enforcement that finally got him loose that time. It was his friends, who scraped together enough money to post his bond. And what did Climax Jim do with his newfound freedom? He went straight out and stole a herd of cattle belonging to the Chiricahua Cattle Company. According to Jim's own version of events, he was simply out riding one day, minding his own business, when he happened to stumble upon a herd wandering without an owner in sight. Being the neighborly sort, he figured the responsible thing to do was drive them along until he located whoever they belonged to. When nobody turned up, he just kept on driving, clear across the state line into New Mexico, where he used those very cattle to start a ranch of his own. It might have worked, too, if the Chiricahua outfit's range boss hadn't noticed his cattle were missing and followed the trail directly to Jim's door. The range boss alerted the sheriff of Apache County, and Climax Jim was, once again, placed under arrest, which brings us right back to where we started this video. The deputies guarding Jim in the town of Springerville decided their new prisoner could use a good scrub, handed him a horse brush and a bar of soap, and walked him toward a horse trough to get cleaned up. It was on that walk that Jim spotted the pony tied to a nearby hitching post, and without a second's hesitation, he leapt onto that horse's back, completely naked, and rode off at full gallop straight through the middle of Springerville, then straight through the neighboring town of Egar, before finally disappearing into the surrounding mountains wearing absolutely nothing at all. Jim would later give a slightly different version of that same escape to journalist George Smalley, claiming he'd actually struck one of the deputies across the face with his own pants while undressing, using the distraction to sprint out of the jail and jump onto that horse. Either way, the outcome was identical. Climax Jim rode to freedom stark naked, only to turn up a few days later at the camp of a lawman named Joe Pierce. Years afterward, when Pierce read Smalley's published account of the escape, he simply confirmed it, saying that's exactly how it happened. By now, you might be wondering how a man could get arrested this many times and somehow spend barely a year total behind bars. The answer is simple. Climax Jim wasn't just gifted at breaking out of jail. He was equally gifted at talking his way out of a conviction in the first place. Take 1907, when he was arrested for forging a check. Jim had sold a small herd of stolen cattle to a local butcher shop, but he wasn't satisfied with the price he'd been paid, so he simply altered the check to reflect a number he considered more reasonable. It didn't work. He was arrested, locked up in the town of Solomonville, and, naturally, escaped once again, as had become something of a personal tradition. When he was eventually recaptured and brought to trial, that forged check was entered into evidence against him. So Jim waited for a moment when the courtroom's attention drifted elsewhere, snatched the check off the evidence table, and calmly stuck it in his mouth alongside his usual wad of chewing tobacco. When the judge demanded the prosecutor produce the missing evidence, Jim simply sat there in the defendant's chair, chewing away as if nothing were the matter. Later, walking out of the courthouse, he reportedly spat what remained of that evidence directly into the judge's personal spittoon. That wasn't the only time Jim beat the odds in a courtroom. On one occasion, he escaped a cattle rustling charge in Graham County by producing witnesses who swore under oath that the crime had actually taken place across the border in Apache County. Undeterred, prosecutors retried him in Apache County for the very same cattle, at which point Jim produced an entirely new set of witnesses who swore the crime had happened back in Graham County after all. He walked away acquitted twice for the same crime, simply by shifting the argument back and forth across a county line. Over a roughly 6-year stretch, grand juries in both Apache and Graham counties handed down a combined total of 5 separate felony indictments against Climax Jim. He talked, chewed, or wriggled his way out of every single one. Eventually, though, even the slipperiest outlaw in Arizona settled down. And as is so often the case, it was the love of a good woman that finally did what a dozen jail cells never could. Rufus found that love in a school teacher 12 years his junior named Gertrude, and the two were married on January 15, 1910. Around that same period, Jim filed a homestead claim near Morenci, which he later sold off to a mining company for a comfortable profit. He and Gertrude welcomed their first child within the year, and 3 more would follow, 1 son and 3 daughters. By around 1911, the growing family had packed up and moved west to California, settling near San Diego, where Jim took up a perfectly ordinary, perfectly legal job as a well digger. It was that same honest job that would ultimately cost him his life. On September 28, 1921, at just 44 years old, Climax Jim fell from a piece of scaffolding while digging a well. This time, there was no wall to tunnel through, no shackle to slip, no witness to bribe. He passed away from the fall, and today he rests at Mount Hope Cemetery in San Diego. There's something almost refreshing about a story like this one, especially after spending so much time covering outlaws whose legacies are built on bloodshed and cruelty. As far as the historical record shows, Climax Jim never killed a single person, and there's no evidence he ever even fired his weapon in the course of committing a crime. He wasn't a hardened killer or a calculated criminal mastermind. He was simply a rascal with a mouthful of tobacco and an absolute gift for making lawmen across 2 counties look thoroughly foolish, time and time again. Of course, The full picture isn't quite so tidy. Records suggest Jim may have briefly been married once before Gertrude to a woman named Virginia Gonzalez back in 1907. What became of that marriage remains a mystery. There's also some evidence hinting that Jim may have participated in at least one train robbery over in New Mexico, a detail that doesn't quite fit the image of the harmless rustler. But that's often the way it goes with characters like Climax Jim. Outside of prison records, census documents, and a single newspaper interview, most of what survives is story, passed down, embellished, and occasionally exaggerated with each retelling. Somewhere in between the legend and the paperwork lies the real Rufus nephew, a man who spent his life making a mockery of the Arizona justice system, and somehow lived to tell the tale. If you got a kick out of the strange, slippery career of Climax Jim, do me a favor. Smash that like button, subscribe if you're new around here, and drop a comment letting me know which forgotten outlaw you want to see covered next. There are plenty more stories like this one still waiting to be dug up. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep your boots on and maybe hang on to your pants a little tighter than old Jim did.